What kind of book was Luke trying to write? That's the big question. I'm your host, Gabriel Bausch. We are in a series of videos asking the question, can we get reliable information about Jesus Christ from the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Now, the answer to this question obviously depends on the type of writing these authors were trying to produce. If they were trying to write fiction, for example, then we shouldn't have much confidence that we can get reliable information about Jesus. So what kind of works were they trying to produce? How would we even know what kind of works they were trying to produce? Well, the most obvious starting place is their own statements. And we find one of the clearest statements of purpose at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. There's quite a bit in these four verses, so let's take a moment to unpack them. Firstly, Luke's preface is highly stylized. In fact, in the original Greek, the entire preface is one long, very balanced sentence. I'm going to put it on the screen in a way that highlights this structure. Now notice that the beginning of verse 1 is parallel with the beginning of verse 3. Inasmuch as many have undertaken, it seemed good to me also. And then the second part of verse 1 and the second part of verse 3, to compile a narrative, to write an orderly account. And then finally, verse 2 and verse 4, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. The formal nature of this preface stands out from the rest of Luke's work, which largely depends on Luke's sources. Now, Luke's preface has a number of parallels with the prefaces of other ancient writings, particularly those that can be categorized as works of history or technical writings. Here's the beginning of a writing of the first century historian Josephus. In the history of the antiquities, most excellent Epaphroditus, I believe that I have made sufficiently clear to any who would come upon that work the antiquity of our Jewish race, the purity of its original stock, and the manner in which it established itself in the land that we occupy today. But since I see that a number of persons, influenced by malicious slander from certain people, discredit statements in my history concerning our antiquity, I consider it my duty to write briefly about all these points, to convict our detractors of opprobrium and deliberate falsehood, to correct the ignorance of others, and to instruct whoever desires to know the truth about the antiquity of our race. Now notice a couple of things here. Firstly, Josephus dedicates his work to a man named Epaphroditus, just as Luke dedicated his work to a man named Theophilus. They even use the same language, the most excellent Epaphroditus and the most excellent Theophilus. Now, secondly, Josephus is writing about a subject over which there was clearly some controversy, just as Luke was writing about Jesus Christ, over whom there was a lot of controversy in the first century and beyond. Now, these sort of parallels between Luke's preface and the prefaces of other ancient writings could be multiplied. But the important point here is that the structure of Luke's preface, along with the very formal literary language that he uses, would have indicated to an ancient reader that he was reading history, that he was reading about real events that actually took place. Now, secondly, Luke's use of the term eyewitnesses is significant in several ways. To begin with, ancient historians felt that the ideal circumstance was that the historian would have actually participated in the events about which he was writing. Now, obviously, this could not always happen. Human beings can only be in so many places and can only experience so many events. So the next best scenario is for the historian to use the testimony of eyewitnesses, the testimony of those who were present at these events. Now, Josephus, in the work that we referenced earlier, addresses both of these possibilities. Everyone that undertakes to deliver the history of actions truly ought to know them accurately himself in the first place, as either having been concerned in them himself or been informed of them by such as knew them. As for the history of the war, I wrote it as having been an actor myself in many of its transactions, an eyewitness in the greatest part of the rest, and as not acquainted with anything whatsoever that was either said or done in it. Now, the word that is here translated eyewitness is actually the same Greek term that Luke uses in his preface. The word means something like a person with firsthand or personal experience. It was used most frequently in the context of technical writings, but both Josephus and Luke use that term in their prefaces. Luke is making the strong claim that the material in his writing is depending on the testimony of those with firsthand experience, of those who are eyewitnesses. But Luke says even more. Luke's sources were eyewitnesses who were present from the beginning. Now, this phrase, from the beginning, was significant. Ancient authors knew that to write history properly, you needed to choose the correct starting point. This is why Josephus wants to emphasize that he was present at all the crucial events connected with the Jewish war with the Romans. Some persons have written histories and published them without having been in the places concerned or having been near them when the actions were done. But these men put a few things together by hearsay and insolently abuse the world and call these writings by the name of histories. As for myself, I have composed a true history of that whole war and all the particulars that occurred therein, as having been concerned in all its transactions. Now, Luke, like Josephus, knows that a proper work of history should be told by those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. And we actually see this emphasis arise in multiple places all throughout the book of Acts. For example, in Acts chapter 1, the apostles want to choose a replacement for Judas. Now notice the prerequisites that they established for such a replacement. It is necessary to choose one of the men who have been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus was living among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. Now later, when Peter is addressing Cornelius and his entire household, we see this same emphasis on being witnesses present for the entirety of Jesus' ministry. Notice what Peter says. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. Now, all four Gospels start the main body of their narrative with the ministry of John the Baptist. This was the proper starting point for telling the story of Jesus. And Luke indicates in his preface that his sources were present from this starting point forward. Now, number 3, Luke indicates that he is not the first person to write about Jesus. He says this, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us." Did Luke use any of these earlier writings? Well, it's pretty obvious that he did. If we make a close comparison of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can make a very strong case that Luke used the Gospel of Mark as one of his sources. Now, this is significant because it gives us an opportunity to see how Luke handled his sources. Did he make major changes? Did he introduce new characters? Did he add supernatural elements? I'm going to put on the screen a passage that occurs in both the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to go through it verse by verse so we can see how Luke handled his sources. Mark chapter 1, verse 21. They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and began to teach. Luke chapter 4, verse 31. And he came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. Now notice the major change here is that Luke adds this phrase, a city of Galilee, probably to clarify where Capernaum was for those who were not familiar with this region. Now back to the Gospel of Mark. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Luke chapter 4, verse 32. And they were amazed at his teaching, because his message was delivered with authority. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. In the synagogue there was a man possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice. Mark chapter 1, verse 24, saying, "What business do you have with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Luke chapter 4, verse 34. Leave us alone. What business do you have with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Back to Mark. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet, come out of him. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet, and come out of him. After throwing him into convulsions and crying out with a loud voice, the unclean spirit came out of him. And when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, it came out of him without doing any harm. And they were all amazed. So they debated among themselves, saying, What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And amazement came upon them all, and they began talking with one another, saying, What is this message? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out. Immediately the news about him spread everywhere into all the surrounding region of Galilee. And the news about him was spreading into every locality of the surrounding region. Now, there are basically no changes in content here. On one occasion, Luke adds a phrase, probably to bring clarification for his readers. On another occasion, he omits something about the scribes, probably because he didn't think it was relevant for his readers. But other than that, there are no major changes. Now, this is typical when we compare the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark. Luke was very careful with how he handled his sources. Now, all of this coheres with what we read in Luke's preface about the process he underwent in composing his gospel, as well as the purpose for which he composed his gospel. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke was writing about real events. His material was based on the testimony of eyewitnesses, and we can see for ourselves how he handled his sources. Now, all of this indicates that we can get reliable information about Jesus Christ from the Gospel of Luke. Now, if you found this video helpful, will you take a moment to leave a comment or like? And if you haven't yet subscribed to The Big Question, I hope you'll take a moment and do so. I look forward to bringing you many more videos in the near future.